Unit Self of the Counselor Therapist. 2.1 Introduction. The self of the therapist is probably one of the most important yet underemphasized aspects of psychotherapy training. Several pioneering family therapists like Murray Bowen, Evan Bossor-Menyi, and Virginia Satter emphasized the use of self in therapy. The necessity and extent of the use of self depend on the theoretical approach used in therapy. For instance, behavioral and cognitive behavioral therapies that focus more on immediate change in cognition and behavior pay less emphasis on the therapist's own reactions in the sessions. It is perhaps more common to discuss the use of self in insight-oriented and client-directed approaches. In family therapy, where the therapist inadvertently becomes a part of the system, it is very likely that the therapist will experience emotions and reactions as a result of her or his interactions with clients. Therapists may identify with the child, for instance, in a family where the parents are considering divorce, or may identify with the mother who is trying to juggle both outside work and parenting. Even experienced therapists are sometimes thrown off balance, if only momentarily, by the intensity of the emotional field in the therapy room. The reactions that one has in the therapy room are not necessarily bad and unwanted. A therapist's reaction in the room may in fact be a vital indicator of interactions in the family system. For instance, if the therapist feels intimidated every time the father raises his voice, it is highly likely that the mother in the room feels the same too. The idea that such parallel processes may occur in a system is called isomorphism, Hansen, 1995. The implications of isomorphism and the usefulness of being aware of one's own reactions as a therapist delineate the importance of learning to use the self of the therapist. This unit will focus on the use of self in therapy by introducing the learner to the definition, its place in various theoretical approaches, and tips on how to incorporate it in training. In this unit, we use the terms therapist and counselor and therapy and counseling interchangeably. Objectives. After studying this unit, you will be able to define and understand the term self of therapist, explore the role of the self of therapist in various theoretical approaches, and provide strategies to explore the influence of the self in therapy. NOSH 2.2 Defining Self of the Therapist. Before examining the use of the self of the therapist in family therapy, it is essential first to define it. What does the self of the therapist mean? While different approaches offer their own descriptions, broadly defined, the self of the therapist is the active and purposeful use of personal aspects of the therapist to further the aims of therapy. Tester, 1992, p. 157. This refers to the use of the therapist's own experience in the session with the clients, as well as in her or his own life in relation to the goal of providing a healing environment for the client. It does not mean using the therapeutic experience to therapize oneself. The goal of fostering change in clients' lives should always be foremost. The practitioner's use of self is a process and can be said to begin as a conversation with self in which she or he constructs ideas, hypotheses, and predictions about interaction with the client family. Tester, 1992, p. 1, emphasis added. Thus, while examining personal experiences in sessions, the therapist should always ask oneself, how does this affect my relationship with my clients? Are there potential roadblocks I might face because of my reactions to them? Thastelegen 2.3 Role of the Self of the Therapist in Some Theoretical Approaches. The development of the self of the therapist is regarded as a significant aspect of an effective therapist, Lum 2002. Many theories consider it as an important factor in the development of a therapeutic relationship. In this section, the role of the self of the therapist in some of the major approaches will be examined. Psychoanalytic theory. Therapists' use of self can be traced to Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic tradition, which insisted that all aspiring psychoanalysts should work toward getting rid of any wish defense complexes or neurotic anxieties that might interfere with the therapeutic process. Home, 1999. The therapist needed to be a blank wall onto which clients could project their own anxieties and fantasies. Treatment involved the therapist then making interpretations from these projected wishes. The therapist, therefore, could not allow her or his own wishes to color the projections. An inability to provide a blank wall could interfere with the treatment of the patient. While notions of the role of the therapist have changed from the image of a cold and detached analyst, the idea that the therapist should work toward freeing herself or himself from the clutches of her or his own fantasies in therapy is echoed by other theorists too. Bowen theory. Murray Bowen was one of the pioneering family therapists who insisted that therapist trainees work on their own levels of differentiation, Aponte and Winter, 1987. At a family therapy conference, he presented a genogram of his family and offered narratives of how he struggled to achieve higher levels of differentiation and decrease emotional reactivity, Bowen, 1972. He encouraged his students to explore family of origin issues because he assumed that the individual or family in therapy would automatically pull the therapist into their emotional field. If the therapist is pulled into this field, then it would impede the process of self-differentiation of the family. Kerr and Bowen, 1988. For example, a family of parents and 3 children present to therapy because the middle child is acting out and is being suspended from school. The family may believe that the problem is with the middle child and that she or he has to be fixed. If the therapist working with them is triangled into this belief system, then she or he may indeed see the child as the problem and align with the parents against the child to correct her or his behaviors. A therapist who is able to be less emotionally reactive may be able to view the issue systemically and be present to hear all sides of the story, instead of forming coalitions against the identified patient. Thus, from a Bowenian perspective, a therapist's reaction and the consequences of this reaction could deeply impact the therapeutic process. Awareness of one's reactions and the ability to recognize red flags about possible triangulation is deemed important. However, it should be noted that it is not necessary for a therapist to have complete emotional autonomy to be effective. She or he just needs to be more autonomous or less reactive than the family. Kerr and Bowen, 1988, p. 283. Through adequate supervision and continual work on family of origin issues, a therapist can gradually increase her or his competence in dealing with anxiety and a potential for triangulation in the client's system. Box 1. Case Vignette. A student therapist was seeing a middle-aged couple in therapy. They had an 18-year-old son who had recently moved away from home to attend college. The couple had sought therapy to address the issue of distance in the relationship. The wife felt that she had suffered all through the marriage because of the constant moving warranted by the husband's job. She reported that since the son moved out, they did not seem to be communicating as before, and she felt depressed and alone. For about a week before seeking therapy, she said she had been crying non-stop. The husband, on the other hand, said that he had no idea that his wife had suffered over the years in their marriage. He, however, had felt a change in their relationship after the son's departure. He noted that he did not feel attracted to her anymore, but felt responsible for her welfare. One of the main reasons that kept him in the marriage was his belief that she could not survive without him. This belief was fueled in part by his knowledge of her troubled childhood and youth. In therapy, the couple seemed cooperative and willing to change. Sessions were emotionally intense, with the wife crying for the most part. At several instances, it felt like the husband agreed with the therapist more than the wife did. After about 8 sessions, after a particularly intense interaction, the wife accused the therapist of not listening to her and of taking the husband's side. This was surprising to the therapist, who believed she was being fair to both of them in the session. In supervision, the therapist was asked how she viewed the presenting problem. Specifically, she was asked to examine her perspective of the function of the symptoms. Through this exploration, the therapist realized that she had inadvertently bought into the couple's belief that the wife could not survive without the husband. The therapist's belief had, in turn, translated into actions in the session that seemed disempowering to the wife. Further in supervision, the therapist was encouraged to explore where the belief came from. Active exploration with the assistance of the supervisor led to the therapist's discovery about her belief about people in therapy as fragile, which originated from her own family of origin experiences. The therapist then was able to constructively use feedback from the supervisor and pull herself out of the emotional triangle in which she had been entangled. This changed stance seemed to empower the wife, who then was able to stand up for herself in the relationship. Experiential therapy. Carl Whitaker also proposed a similar assertion that the therapist's own psychological health is an important factor in the therapeutic process. Whitaker and Keith, 1981. Whitaker believed that more than theory or techniques, a therapist's effectiveness was a result of the level of personal authenticity, openness, and spontaneity. He also emphasized the use of transference in the therapy process. Home, 1999. In Whitaker's experiential approach to therapy, the therapeutic process is conceptualized as an opportunity for corrective emotional experiences via the therapeutic relationship. In fact, Whitaker and Keith, 1981, state that the therapist's personality and psychological health yield the greatest rewards in treatment, p. 2 for 17. Contrary to the Bowenian approach, where the therapist strives to reduce interpersonal anxiety, the experiential therapist seeks to increase anxiety in sessions. The increase in anxiety is assumed to create encounters in therapy that challenge the status quo in the family. In order for these encounters to occur, the therapist has to be aware of her or his own emotional reactions and be willing to withstand an increased level of anxiety. Building this skill requires a therapist to identify her or his reactions that could potentially obstruct the encounter. For instance, in a session, if the therapist is intimidated by the increased levels of anxiety, creating meaningful encounters and providing a holding environment to contain clients' emotions may be difficult. Virginia Satter emphasized the importance of resolving family of origin issues in order to remain therapeutically congruent. Lum, 2002. The main aim of Satter's model of therapy is to help clients be more congruent and in touch with their self. In order to facilitate this process, therapists are required to be emotionally healthy so that they can be fully present for their clients. And if therapists are themselves hesitant to address issues that block their emotional health, it is unlikely that their clients would be able to do so. The family system will be supported to heal and change when therapists are able to be clear and congruent. Lum, 2002, p. 191. Thus, addressing one's own biases and struggles with incongruence is important. Contextual theory. The use of self of the therapist assumes great importance in the contextual approach. In fact, Boser-Menyunai and Krasner, 1986, contend that the person of the therapist is his or her Prinzhul in therapy, p. 396. The overarching goal of contextual therapy is to restore imbalance in relationships. Issues of fairness, justice, trust, loyalty, and entitlement constitute the core concepts in this approach. In order for the therapist to facilitate the repair of imbalance in relationships, she or he should be able to offer a trustworthy relationship and be willing to take a multilateral stance. Taking a multilateral stance requires one to be partial to everyone in the therapy room, as well as to those who could be affected by the therapeutic process. Being partial means acknowledging one's pain and suffering, as well as strengths and resources, while not aligning against anyone in the system. Adoption of this approach requires personal freedom from one's own entitlements, conviction in the belief that fairness can be restored in relationships, courage to bring up issues of unfairness, and capacity for empathy toward all family members. Boser-Menyunai and Krasner, 1986. Self-reflection is thus an integral part of learning to be a competent contextual therapist. The more aware the therapist is of her or his own entitlements and struggles with fairness in relationships, the better she or he will be in being fair to the client system. 2.4. How to use the self of the therapist. In the previous section, we discussed the use of self in some of the major approaches to therapy. All of them essentially view work on the self of the therapist as paramount to the success of therapy. The underlying theme in all of them is that the therapist should be able to achieve the tasks that the clients are expected to, as conceptualized by the respective theoretical assumptions. Thus, if the aim of the therapy is to increase differentiation of the client system, the therapists are required to work on their own differentiation levels. If the aim is to foster congruence, then the therapist should be aware enough to be congruent with her or his self. And if the aim in therapy is to restore fairness, then the therapist should explore issues of fairness in his or her own life. Lum, 2002, states, how therapists view clients will affect how therapeutic relationships will develop. P. 87. Beliefs about the clients are shaped by therapists' own experiences. The examination of the therapist's experiences then needs to be an integral part of training. Tim and Blow, 1999, suggest that with necessary groundwork, this exercise could result in personal growth for the therapist. If the groundwork is not laid, then negative consequences could occur when therapists attempt to access and explore their emotional reactions. The presence of a safe environment with a supervisor offers the best place for such exploration. Confidentiality must be ensured, and both supervisor and supervisee must be willing to explore self-of-therapist issues. While work on the use of self is a continuous, ongoing process, Tim and Blow, 1999, suggest a few techniques to initiate it. The main aim of these techniques is to increase therapists' awareness of themselves and to keep a watch for potential obstacles in the therapeutic relationship. To this end, it may be useful to draw a genogram of one's family and identify patterns of interaction. Interviewing family members is recommended to get an accurate picture of members' relational styles. Some questions to ask are: 1. How do members in my family express emotions? 2. How do they deal with stressors? 3. Have there been any significant losses? 4. Have there been any mental illnesses? 5. What is the predominant coping style? 6. How do members cope with conflicts? 7. What are the strengths present in the family system? Identifying both constraints and strengths in the family could provide the therapist with clues about one's own relating styles. Tim and Blow, 1999. Examining one's family of origin experiences also helps identify therapists' beliefs about the clients and about their role in the client system. See case example cited in the previous section. A step above formulating a genogram is doing a double genogram, Tim and Blow, 1999. Here, the therapist lays out her or his genogram and the client's genogram in order to examine similarities and differences. This exercise can be particularly useful when a therapist begins to identify with the client very closely. While constructing the genogram, it may be helpful to note the developmental stage of the therapist. Sometimes, issues presented by clients could be similar to the ones currently faced by the therapist. For instance, a therapist eager to leave her or his parents' home and live independently may suddenly have an influx of clients struggling with issues of autonomy. Or a therapist who is currently debating whether to stay in her or his marriage could see clients facing similar dilemmas. In such cases, it would be important to find out whether the therapist is looking for particular issues in the client's system or whether the problems were genuinely presented by the client. Use of self is a process. It starts at the first contact with clients and continues until termination. Sometimes, lessons learned with one client may be useful in another situation. Thus, one cannot pinpoint a time when a therapist should cease using the self of the therapist. For beginning therapists, this may seem overwhelming at first. For instance, a first-year doctoral student had just started seeing clients in therapy. She or he was being supervised individually as well as in a group, and she or he had just been introduced to the importance of the use of self. One supervision session, she or he noted that in sessions, she or he was juggling a lot of things at the same time. Questions like, what does the client mean by this? What reaction am I experiencing? What does that mean? What am I supposed to say next? Simultaneously plagued her or his mind, thus paralyzing her or him in the session. It is always best to remember that in therapy too, one should walk before starting to run. Consider it as a skill just like any other. For example, driving. When you first drive a vehicle, you have to pay attention to many things at the same time. If it's a two-wheeler, then you would wonder if you have the right balance, whether you are on the right side of the road, whether the light is on in the dark, when to indicate a turn, how to navigate the traffic, etc. It seems a tremendous task at first, but as you learn and as you become aware of the necessary steps involved, you don't have to think about it all the time. You will be able to hop on the vehicle and easily weave through traffic. The skill of using oneself needs to be practiced, discussed with peers and supervisors, and ultimately should become second nature to you as a therapist. But remember, you don't have to dive before learning to swim first. 2.5 Research on Use of Self of Therapist. In a review of research examining the impact of the use of self on outcomes in therapy, Home, 1998, noted very few studies. Even among the studies, there was marginal empirical evidence for a relationship between the therapist's intrapsychic health and outcomes, specifically among trainee therapists treating moderately and severely dysfunctional clients. This conclusion was based on the lack of uniform strategies to measure the use of self of the therapist and the outcome of therapy among these studies. Moreover, the available research was limited in its designs, making it difficult to generalize from the study's conclusions. The lack of empirical evidence, therefore, does not negate the importance of the use of self in therapy. Obviously, more research is needed to describe the impact of a therapist's work on the use of self. Meanwhile, the personal development of therapists remains a critical issue facing psychotherapy training programs. Schnarch, 1991. 2.6 Let us sum up. In this unit, we explored the importance of using the self of the therapist. Major therapy approaches, especially those that are insight-oriented, advocate the need to train therapists to use their self as a tool in therapy. Increased awareness of one's self and the ability to use personal reactions in understanding clients contribute to a healing relationship. Though empirical research in this area has been limited, one cannot dispute the need to use oneself in therapy. For the development of a therapeutic relationship and to create meaningful encounters, the therapist should be aware of and acknowledge her or his reactions and responses in the session and be able to use them for the benefit of the clients. 2.7 Glossary Isomorphism, the idea that some parallel processes may occur in a system. Self of the therapist, the active and purposeful use of personal aspects of the therapist to fulfill the aims of therapy. Experiential approach to therapy. The therapeutic process is conceptualized as an opportunity for corrective emotional experience via the therapeutic relationship.